What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. So today's video, we're working on another BMW 3 Series. This is E46 in the BMW world as far as chassis goes, 99 to 05 3 Series. We're going to be doing an oil filter housing gasket on this car today, as well as a oil line. This gasket is what we're going to be replacing. It's actually sealing off the oil filter housing itself to the side of the engine block. This is a $4 gasket that requires about 3 hours worth of work in order to replace. It sounds crazy, but it's just how it is. Also, while we're in there replacing this gasket, we're going to be going to replace this oil line as well. This is actually the oil line that supplies pressurized oil from the back of the oil filter housing up to the VANOS adjustment unit on the front of the engine. These tend to leak around where this rubber section of this hose goes into the metal section here. We can see that this is leaking a little bit down there where it goes in the oil filter housing, and we have a large amount of oil leaking out of the gasket itself. I'm going to go over the tools needed in order to do this job, as well as the just walk you guys through how to do it. Not crazy hard to do, just a lot of stuff that's got to come off. So let's get to it. Alright, so the first thing we're going to take off is going to be our undershield. It's a Phillips screwdriver on these cars. We're going to take this off. There's 2 on this side, there's 3 along the back here, and then 2 on this side. We're going to take all these Phillips screws there, like just kind of twist lock. They're not actually screws, they're like a cam style lock in place. So we're going to take these screws out. Set our splash shield down and out of the way. The only reason why I'm doing this, you don't have to do this, but this just prevents you from having a ton of cleanup when you're all done with everything. Because if you don't take this off, you're going to fill this up with oil when you take your oil filter housing off of the engine. I'm going to set that out to the side, and then you can, if you choose to, you don't have to do this as well. I'm going to take this skid plate back here off. It has 8 16mm bolts holding it in place. I'm only going to be taking this off because I'm going to be trying to clean as much of the oil residue off the side of the engine as possible. And the oil residue has a tendency to run towards the back of the engine and down onto the skid plate back here underneath the oil pan, and I don't want it to collect in this skid plate. So I'm going to take this off so that my oil falls into my catch pan on the floor, and then I don't have to worry about cleaning this off as much when I'm all done with everything. Alright, so once you guys get your splash trays off underneath, your plastic front one, and then your metal tray if you choose to, we're going to come back up top. There's a couple different areas you can start up here, but I'm going to start with taking this cowling off across the top here. We're going to take this cowling across the top off. We're going to take our air box out. I like to use a pair of side cutters when I take this out, even though I have plenty of trim tools that I could use to do it. The side cutters seem to be able to work the best for getting underneath these clips. Take our little intake box off. Take this stuff off separately. Take our air box loose. Pull this stuff all out as one piece, and we're going to set it off to the side. Next thing we're going to work on is getting our fan out. Now, if you have a automatic car, you're gonna have a fan clutch in here that needs to come off in order to get this fan out of the way. You don't have to take this fan out. You can try to work around it if you want to. I believe I've done it in the past, taking all your stuff off over here in order to get this oil filter thing off without taking this out. It's just a lot easier to get it out of your way so you can get down here all this belt drive stuff. On the clutch fan, I use an 1¼ inch wrench to take it off. I'm not sure what size it is in metric. I'll put it here in the video. I'll look it up later on and I'll put it here in the video. It is reverse thread. So when you go to take it off, you're actually gonna, if you're looking at it from the front of the engine, you're gonna take it, you're gonna tighten it in order to break it loose. So you're actually gonna turn it towards the driver side of the car in order to break it loose. Normally what I do is I take the wrench, put it on there and hit the end of the wrench with a hammer and it'll knock it loose and then you can just spin it off by hand. This car, being a manual car, gets a electric fan. I'm going to take this fan out. It's relatively easy. There's a push pin here in the corner that you're going to pop out with a pair of side cutters, and then in this corner there's a T25 screw. You're going to undo those two and then undo these plug connections here for this fan, and then you're going to lift the fan out of there. So I'm going to get these out and we're going to pull the fan out. All right, so once you got your fan out of there, the next step is going to be to get your belt off of your alternator and your power steering pump over here. If you have an older car that has the original hydraulic style tensioner on it, you're gonna have to pop the cap off of this pulley down here, and in the middle of that pulley is an 8mm Allen. You're gonna use that 8mm Allen in the middle of that and turn it or tighten, push like you're trying to tighten that Allen screw, and it's going to take the tension off the belt and let you take your belt tension off. Once you get your belt tension off, we're going to work on getting the alternator off. In order to get to the top screw that holds the alternator in, there's another cover on this as well. You're going to pop these two covers off with screwdrivers in order to get them off. So we're going to get our belt off. And normally what I do, since you're going to be making a little bit of a mess over here with oil and stuff like that, and you don't want to mess your belt up, as I take it and I pull it off to the side over here so it doesn't get anything on it. I will put a picture up later on in the video when we're going back together. Actually, I'll put one up right now of the belt routing for this. So that you guys can reference back to it when you're trying to put your stuff back together. So now that we've got our belt off, we're gonna take 16mm socket. We're gonna break the bolt loose up here. And then there's another bolt down there. This guy right here. Down at the bottom of the alternator, it's another 16. It's almost directly above the center line of the power steering pump pulley. We're going to take that belt off, or that bolt loose as well, and then those two bolts are going to come out in order to take our alternator out. Now before we do that, what I want to tell you guys is you're going to have to take your power cable off the back of your alternator. In order to do that, on the back of the alternator here, there's a 17mm nut. You're going to take that off and take the plug connection off so you can take your alternator out. Before taking the 17mm nut off, you're going to want to come over here to this battery junction here. If you take this nut off and take this cable here off that runs across the cowl here, that is all of the power from the battery in the car to the engine itself. So if you're doing an alternator or a starter and you want to get battery power off of the engine, take this cable off of here and set this cable down here somewhere to where it doesn't touch this, and your engine 12-volt circuit is dead. So this is a 19mm. We're going to take this off, then we're going to take the nut off the back of the alternator and take the power cable off, and then we're going to get those two 60mm bolts out, and we're going to pull our alternator out. I also wanted to put a little note in here. I thought about it after the fact. I told you guys how to take that mechanical style tensioner off or hydraulic style tensioner off on these older cars. If this goes bad, or you have a new enough car, it will have a spring style tensioner there instead of this hydraulic tensioner. The spring style tensioner has a 16mm like bolt head on the body of the tensioner itself that you're going to use to take the tension off of this tensioner in order to take your belt off. Just want to let you guys know that. All right, so I want to show you guys here taking this alternator off. On the so this is in the car this way. This is the top bolt. This is the bottom bolt that actually pinches over top of the oil filter housing. This back bolt is like a sleeve inside of the alternator. This is going to be very tight on the oil filter housing bracket. You're going to have to pry and wiggle this piece loose to get it off of the bracket in order to be able to take your alternator out of the car. You're not going to break anything, and one tip that I can give you guys as well, going back together to make your life a little easier so you don't have to try to hammer or try to like force this back in place, is to take the screw that came out of this lower bolt, put it back in place, screw it back in a couple threads, put this part of this bracket right here over top of a socket or something like that, and give this bolt a few taps, and it'll knock this sleeve back that direction a little bit and open up this gap here and make it easier to put back on. And then when you tighten this bolt up, it's actually going to pull the sleeve back in and tighten everything up. So it's not going to hurt anything. It just helps you putting everything back together. Also, with the alternator, this car had it most of the time. Most of the cars I've worked on in the past, this piece off the back of the alternator has this tube on it that comes off the bottom of the alternator and runs down into a brake duct in the front left corner of the car. Probably a good 75% of the cars I work on don't have this tube on them anymore because it's been ripped off by somebody doing some other service. This car had it. Just be aware that this could possibly be there. Before you take your alternator loose, you can pop this off here. It just kind of snaps over top of this plastic housing in the back of the alternator. Just wanted to let you guys know that, so that if you encounter that, you're not questioning what's going on. Now that we've got our alternator off, the next step is going to be to take our power steering pump off. In order to do that, there's a 13mm bolt here that runs from the back of the pump towards the front of the car. There's another 13mm bolt down here on the other side of this bracket that runs from the front of the pump towards the back of the car. And then there's also underneath the alternator, or the power steering pump down here where my finger is at, is another 13mm bolt that goes from a bracket off the back of the pump into the bottom of the oil filter housing. So you're going to take those 3 13s off, and we're going to take the pump off. Once we get the pump out of the way and down, it'll actually kind of fall down and sit down in there. It's got some hoses attached to it, so it's not going to go too far. We are going to get the oil reservoir for the power steering system unbolted. That also has 2 13s that hold to the oil filter housing. I'm going to take that loose and set it off to the side over here in this fender area. And then once we do that, we're going to get to getting our oil filter housing off. So I'm going to get this stuff out of the way, and I'm going to show you guys what we have to do in order to get that oil filter housing off. All right, so we got our power steering pump out of the way. It's laying down there, down on the sway bar itself. Got our power steering reservoir out of the way and pushed off to the side. Don't worry about this leaking. I've done countless oil filter housings on these cars, and I've never had an issue with this reservoir leaking, even though it's tipped off to the side. So don't worry about it. Once you get to this point, you have 2 plug connections on this oil filter housing that have to come unplugged. There's one here, and then there's another one back there in the back. Unplug those 2. Those are oil pressure switches. You want to make sure that you unplug them and not mess up the wiring for them. They're rather important. One thing I do to eliminate the amount of mess that I make when I'm doing this is take the oil filter cap and filter itself loose, let all the oil drain out of the housing itself back into the engine, and then take this cap off completely just to get it out of the way. And it cuts down on the amount of stuff that leaks off the side of the engine and down the oil pan and into your drip pan on the floor and all over things. Obviously, it's not all going to end up directly in the pan on the floor. It's going to end up all over the side of the engine. I just do this to cut down the amount of it that's leaking down the side of the engine. Once I take that off, the only thing left to do, pre-disassembly, is to take this VANOS oil line bolt loose. You can either take it loose at the back there and leave it attached to the VANOS assembly up here on the front of the motor. It's a 19mm bolt on either end. I'm going to take the whole thing out with the oil filter housing because I'm replacing that line. You can do it either way. If you're not replacing the line, you can take it off in the back there. It's a little difficult to get to back there, so I prefer to take it off up here. One thing I do want to note is if you're not replacing this line, if you're doing the oil filter housing, you're going to need new crush washers for this bolt here where it goes into the VANOS assembly on the front of the motor. You cannot reuse those crush washers. So I'm going to get that stuff off, plug connections off, oil cap off, and then I'm going to go over showing you guys how to take the bolts off and take the oil filter housing out. All right, so we got our oil cap off. We got our VANOS oil line broke loose here. Plug connections off the back. Now when you're coming over here to take the oil filter housing off, 6 bolts holding it on. There's 4 that you can see here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. There's one in this little hole down here. And then there's also 2 more up here at the top. There's one right here. And then there's another one back there. So you're gonna take all 6 of these bolts off. I will warn you guys, I'm pretty sure each set of 2 is a completely different length. I believe this one's longer than, most of them are a completely different length. I think a couple of them are the same size, but what I do is I usually set a magnetic tray off to the side. If you guys don't have magnetic trays, something like a piece of cardboard or something like that, and get your layout of where these bolts go in this filter housing. And when you take them out, set them down. Like if you're looking at it, take your piece of cardboard, lay it down flat like this, and set your bolts on that piece of cardboard in the pattern in which they go on the side of this oil filter housing, so you don't put them back in the wrong spot when you're going back together. So we're gonna break all these 13mm bolts loose. All right, so this is our oil filter housing. Obviously, our belt sensor is mounted to it. This is our VANOS oil line. It runs around the back here to the back. This is our oil pressure switch. I believe this is the VANOS oil pressure switch to let it know that there's oil supplied to the VANOS. And then, not really much else to this. This right here is actually the gasket that we're dealing with that's leaking. This one is pretty well flat. It's actually completely flush against this housing, hence the reason why it's leaking. They're rubber to begin with, but over time they get really, really hard and they turn almost into like a plastic and they stop sealing. They're not really soft enough to seal anything back anymore. This one is going to be a pain to get out of here. I'm just telling you guys right now, when they're flush like this and they're really hard, they're relatively difficult to get out of this groove just because of the fact that they're been in there for so long and they're so stuck in there, and it's going to break off into like 20 pieces while I'm trying to take it out. I use a combination of a pocket screwdriver and a pick, whether it be a 90-degree or a straight pick, to work these out of here. There's a little bit of gap between it and the body of the oil filter housing that you can get those tools into to pop it loose, but you're gonna have to work at it. They're gonna get stuck, just forewarning you guys. So I'm gonna get this out. I'm gonna get this whole housing cleaned up before we put everything back in the car. And I just want to show you guys too over here. This is the actual mating surface right here where that gasket mates to. You see how much oil leaked out even though I pulled the oil filter out of the housing first. If you had not pulled the oil filter housing out of there first, there would have been a quart of oil down the side of this motor and all over all of your stuff down here. So taking the oil filter out definitely helps with cleanup here. I'm going to get all this cleaned up as well. Nice and shiny. You don't want any residue left over here, because anything that's left over here can potentially look like a leak when you're done with your repair. So you want to get this as clean as possible so you can verify that there's no other issues when everything's going back together. One thing I do also want to point out to you guys when you're going back together is there is a dowel in this top right hand corner and the bottom left hand corner of this housing. Make sure when you're putting it back together that you seat the oil filter housing on those dowels first before trying to put the screws in and tighten them in, because you can get it kind of weird in there and screw them down and just jam it onto those dowels, and it's not going to seal properly against the engine. So I'm going to get everything cleaned up here. I'm going to get the oil filter housing cleaned up, and I'm going to go back together with this, and we're going to be done with this job. All right, so we got our area in here cleaned up. Obviously, it doesn't have to be perfect. You just want to get as much of the stuff cleaned up in here so that going forward, if you have another leak, you're not possibly seeing any of the residual from this repair here. Just make your life easier, clean all this stuff up before you put everything back together. We got our oil filter housing cleaned up as well. It's very nice to have access to a parts washer. Just want to let you guys know that. So we're going to get our gasket put back in this groove here, and I'm going to put the oil filter housing itself back on the car. I'm going to show you guys lining it up and getting the bolts started. All right, so we got our oil filter put back in place. Remember, when you're going back together, to make sure that your top right and bottom left hand screw holes are sitting on those dowels properly, and press down onto them before you try to start putting the bolts in. If you have power tools, you can run all these screws down with power tools. Just don't run them down full tilt because they have to be torqued. The torque specs for all these bolts are 33 Newton meters for the oil filter housing. I will put a link at the end of the video, or a picture at the end of the video, sorry, with the torque specs for everything that I took apart here, so that you have a reference to use to put everything back together. I'm going to go ahead and get this all buttoned back up. Obviously, putting everything back together is the exact reverse or removal. The order in which you do things doesn't have to be exact, but try to keep with the order in which you took it apart, just because certain things interfere when you're trying to go back together. But I'm going to get this buttoned up, and we're going to be done with this job. All right, so we got this job all finished up, got everything put back together. We put all our skid plates and splash tray for the front and everything back up underneath. Put a new oil filter in it, drained and refilled the oil with the proper quantity. Please, guys, if you're doing this, I recommend doing an oil change. You're opening up the oil filter housing and introducing dirt and debris just by taking that apart into the oil circuit, and you want to make sure you get that stuff out of there. So do an oil change when you're doing this. Maybe plan on doing it when your oil change is due, so you're not wasting, oil and a filter that you're going to change in a couple thousand miles. Just plan it around an oil change. That would be my recommendation. Other than that, we're all done with this job. If you guys have any questions about this repair or anything on an E46, please comment down below. I'll be sure to answer any questions that I can. I would really appreciate it if you guys subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you later.